Today we're going to be discussing verses 11 to 15 of Upadēśa Undiyār. In verses 3 to 9, well, in the first two verses, Bhagavan basically condemns the path of kamya karma, doing actions for the fulfillment of desires. From verses 3 to 9, he talks about the paths of karma and bhakti. He doesn't treat them as two separate paths because nishkamya karma, action done without desire, can only be done effectively if it's done with love for God, as he implies in verse 3. So from verse 3 onwards, he's talking about the different forms of karma by body, speech, and mind that one can do with love for God. So according to Bhagavan, karma yoga is not a separate yoga. It is the preliminary stages of the path of bhakti are karma yoga, because we do actions by body, speech, and mind, that is puja, japa, and dhyana, with love for God. And then he talked about the path of karma continues up to verse 7. In verse 8, Bhagavan points out the most important change on the bhakti marga, which is the change from anya bhava to ananya bhava. Anya bhava means meditation on God as something other than oneself, whereas ananya bhava means meditation on God as nothing other than oneself. In other words, meditating on oneself alone. So long as we're meditating on God as anything other than ourselves, our attention is going away from ourselves towards some other thing, the name and form of God. So it is an action. Whereas when our attention turns back towards ourselves, that is the cessation of action, because the nature of ego or mind is to rise and be active when attending to things other than itself, and to subside back into its natural state of stillness, inactivity, when it attends to itself. That is emphasized by him in verse 9, where he says, by the strength of this ananya bhava, being in the state of sat bhava, that's a state of being, which transcends all bhavana, all thinking, all mental activity, alone is parabhakti tattva, the nature or reality or true state of supreme devotion. So that's bhakti marga and karma marga. Then in verse 10, he said, this was the last verse we dealt with last time, he said, udita idatil odungi iratil adu karmam yogam adu karmam bhaktium undipara adu yoga jnanamum undipara. That means subsidingly being in the place from which one rose, that is karma and bhakti, that is yoga and jnana. So he's up to verse 9, he had dealt with karma and bhakti. From 11 to 15, he deals with yoga, and then from 16 onwards, he deals with jnana. So I just go over that again, just to remind of the structure of Upadēśa Undiyār and where these 5 verses on yoga fit in. So it's from verse 11 that he begins to talk about yoga. That's yoga in the sense of Raja-yoga, but most specifically prāṇāyāma, which is one of the central practices of Raja-yoga. But what he says about prāṇāyāma can equally well apply to all other yoga practices. First, in verses 11 and 12, he explains what is the efficacy of prāṇāyāma. In verse 11, he says, Vali Uḻḷadu Vale Padu Pul Pol Ullamum Odungurum Oduka Upayam Idu. So what this means is the first sentence is the first clause is Vali Uḻḷadu. That means when one restrains the breath within. Vali is breath, ul means within, adhika means to restrain. When one restrains the breath within, Uḻḷadu pole, like a bird caught in a net. Ulamum adungaram, the mind also will be restrained. That is, when one restrains the breath within, like a bird caught in a net, the mind also will be restrained. And then in the next sentence he says, Odaka upayam idu, which means this is a means to restrain, meaning this is a means to restrain the mind. That is the activity of the breath and the mind are very closely connected. When, for example, we are in a very agitated state of mind, our breathing will tend to be fast. When we are in a shocked state of mind, our breathing suddenly comes to an end. Like if we hear some shocking news, we say, it took my breath away. Suddenly our breathing stops because we're in a state of shock. So mind and breath are very closely connected. When we restrain the mind by turning our attention within, that automatically calms down the breathing. The breath will be calmed and eventually even come to a stop, to a standstill, if we attend to ourselves keenly enough. It works the other way also. If we restrain the breath, either by the usual way in yoga is they practice prāṇāyāma. That's their regulating the breath, controlling the breath. So many seconds breathing in, so many seconds breathing out, so many seconds holding the breath. This is a way of restraining the breath, and that also restrains the mind. Another method, which is used particularly in, it's also used in yoga, but more predominantly in Buddhism, is just watching the breath. Bhagavan also said, if you want to, all these pranayama exercises actually aren't necessary. If you want to use the breath to calm down the mind, simply attending to the breathing will tend to calm it down and thereby calm down the mind. And Bhagavan gives here an analogy, like a bird caught in a net. That is, when we hold our breath, that is restraining the mind, like holding a bird in a net. If we're holding our breath, our mind can't be very active, because as soon as our mind becomes active, that tends to agitate the breathing. So if for some reason we are trying to hold our breath, our mind will be relatively quiet during that time when we're holding our breath. So this is a means to restrain, he says. Oduka upayam idu. That means a means to restrain the mind. So it's a technique to calm down and restrain the activity of the mind, is to restrain the breathing, or just to watch the breathing. In the next verse, he continues and he explains this a bit further. What he says in the next verse is verse 12. Ulumum virum unavum seilum ulavam kilei irendu. That means mind and breath. That's ulumum virum are two branches. Kilei irendu, two branches, which have ulavam unavum seilum, knowing and doing. That is, the mind is what is sometimes called Kriya Shakti. It's a power of knowing, whereas the breath, or prāṇa generally, is a Kriya Shakti. It's a path of, it's a power of doing. But these two powers, they're like two branches. And then in the next sentence he says, Ondru avatrin mulam. Their root is one. That is the root of both the mind. Mind here is used in the sense of the thinking faculty, the other thoughts of the mind, and breath. They both share a common root. That root is ego. So when we rise as ego, we experience ourselves both as body and mind, and the body obviously is a living body. So the prāṇa, the breathing, and all other physiological functions are going on in whatever body we currently experience as ourself. So both of these, they share a common root. This is why by restraining one, you restrain the other. Bhagavan doesn't explicitly say that, but this verse 12 is intended as an explanation of what he says in verse 11. That is, what he says in verse 11 is something that we can observe by ourselves. If we try and restrain our breath, we will find that's restraining the mind. If we try and restrain the mind by turning within, that will also restrain the breath. So why is this so? Because they're like two branches sharing a common root. The common root is moolam, is ego. So when we rise as ego, mind and breath both become active. Our aim is, as he said in verse 11, it's a means to restrain the mind. Why do we want to restrain the mind? Because the outward going activity of the mind is what causes unhappiness, what causes misery. So we want to restrain the mind in order to experience the happiness which is our real nature. However, there are different degrees of restraint, but if we're talking about when we're talking about complete restraint, we can also call that dissolution. There are two types of dissolution. There's laya and nasa. That's what he says. That's the subject of verse 13. What he says here is, ileumum nasum irendu am odukum. That is, we can rearrange that in the normal prose order, would be odukum, ileumum nasum irendu am. That is, dissolution is of two kinds, laya and nasa. When he talks about dissolution, that is odukum here, he's talking about dissolution of the mind. This is the word he uses here, odukum, is a noun that means subsidence or cessation or dissolution. It's the same word he uses in the second sentence of verse 11, but there he used it in a verb form as oduka. Oduka means to restrain or to curb or to make it cease being active. And here he uses the word odukum, which is the noun form of the same verb, which means the dissolution or in this context, when he's talking about laya and nasa, it means for a complete dissolution, that is complete restraint of the mind. So dissolution is two, laya and nasa. That means dissolution or complete subsidence or cessation of ego or mind is of two kinds, laya and nasa. Laya means temporary dissolution. Nasa means permanent dissolution or annihilation, destruction. Then in the next sentence he says, Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu. That means what is lying down. Lying down here means dissolved in laya, will arise. So if the mind is dissolves in laya, it will rise again. It's the implication. Then in the third sentence he says, Eradu uru mindel. Mindedel. That means if its form dies, it will not rise. That means if the ego dies, the form of the mind or the form of ego dies, it will not rise. So what he's saying here is that there are two types of dissolution of mind. Either it's temporary, in which case it's called laya, or it's permanent, in which case it's called nasa. If the mind dissolves in laya, it will rise. If it dies in nasa, it will not rise. Because on the spiritual path, what we are seeking is our real nature, which is eternal happiness. So long as we rise as ego, we are seemingly separated from the infinite happiness, which is our real nature. So the spiritual goal is not just laya, which is a temporary dissolution, but nasa, permanent dissolution. An example of laya that we all experience every day is sleep. In sleep, the mind is completely dissolved. Mind, ego, whatever we call it, is completely dissolved, and we are therefore in a happy and peaceful state. But inevitably, having fallen asleep, sooner or later we wake up again. Whether in this dream or in some other dream, we will certainly wake up again until the mind is destroyed. So what is the relevance of this verse to the previous two verses? In the previous two verses, he talked about how we can restrain or curb the activity of the mind by curbing the breath. But here he talks about two types of dissolution. The significance of this is we can understand more clearly if we consider what he says in in the 8th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, in which he specifically says that pranayama is an aid to restrain the mind, but it cannot bring about manōlaya. So in this context, I think it would be useful to go through the 8th paragraph, sentence by sentence. What he says in the first sentence is, that's of the 8th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, manam adangu vadaku vicharane ye tabira veru tahunta upayangal illai. That means for the mind to cease, settle, subside, be dissolved or disappear or become still, except vicharana, that's self-investigation, there are no other adequate means. Why are there no other adequate means? He explains in the next sentence. Matra upayam galinal adanginal manam adangi pol irandu marupadiyam kilambi vidum. If made to cease, subside or disappear by other means, the mind, remaining for a while as if it had ceased, will again rise up, sprout or emerge or start. So if we restrain the mind, if we curb the mind or restrain the outward going activity of the mind by any means other than self-investigation, though the mind will be curbed for a while, it will remain as if it had ceased, he says, it will again rise up. That is, even if by, okay, I'll continue reading and then I'll explain it. Then in the next sentence, he says, pranayāma talum manum adangam, which means even by pranayama, breath restraint, the mind will cease. So we can that's the connection with these verses of Upadēśa Undiyār. That is, by pranayama we can bring about cessation of mind. But he continues, Anal prāṇan adangi irukum varayal manam adangi irandu prāṇan veli padum podu tānam veli padu vasane vayatal alayam. That means, however, so long as prana remains subsided, mind will also remain subsided. And when prana emerges, it, meaning the mind, will also emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas. He's saying here that mind will emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas is very significant, because this implies that, well, two things in this sentence. Firstly, he says, so long as the breath is restrained, the mind will be restrained. But as soon as the breath becomes active again, the mind will become active again. The implication is that the most we can achieve from pranayama is manōlaya. We cannot achieve manōnasa. That's the implication. He states that explicitly in the final sentence, but the implication here is, but pranayama is a means to bring about temporary restraint of mind. And when that temporary restraint is taken to its limit, it results in laya, complete dissolution of mind, but only for a short while. Oh yes, I was saying about this sentence. Anal prāṇan adangi irkumvarayal, manam adangi irandu, prāṇam velipadum podu, tānam velipadu vasane vayatal alayam. However, so long as prana remains subsided, mind will also remain subsided. And when prana emerges, it will also emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas. That is, though we can bring about a temporary restraint of mind by pranayama, the mind will remain restrained only so long as the prana remains restrained. When the prana again becomes active, mind will again become active. If we take the restraint of, if we restrain the mind to the maximum extent possible using the tool of pranayama, we will bring about manōlaya. Mind will dissolve in a state which is in yoga typically called nivikalpa samadhi. But it's only a temporary nivikalpa samadhi. It's only a manōlaya, not manonasa. And very significantly, Bhagavan says here, when the prana emerges, the mind will also emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas. The significance of his saying it will wander under the sway of its vasanas is that the ultimate aim of any form of spiritual practice is to purify the mind. The impurities in the mind are the Vishaya vasanas, the inclinations that draw the mind to face outwards, to go outwards, to attend to things other than itself. So, between verses 3 and 9, he was talking about the different practices of bhakti and their relative efficacy in purifying the mind. Purifying the mind, as I say, means reducing the strength of the Vishaya vasanas. The vasanas, what he referred to in verse 2 of Upadēśa Undiyār as vittu, as seeds. It's this, what makes us fall in the ocean of action is not the actions themselves or their fruit, it's the seeds. That's the vasanas that prompt us to do the same actions again and again. So even though we experience the fruit of actions, the seeds remain and prompt us to do the same type of actions again and again. So vasanas are a problem that we need to get rid of. By karma yoga and bhakti yoga together, they can bring about a purification of the mind. They can reduce the strength of the Vishaya vasanas. The implication here is that though you bring about the restraint of mind by pranayama, as soon as the mind comes out again, the vasanas again become active. The implication is that the vasanas are not destroyed in manōlaya. So this is why Bhagavan always said we should avoid manōlaya. It's okay to restrain the mind to a certain extent, but having restrained the mind, you need to turn it within. Otherwise, you by merely restraining the mind, you're not reducing the strength of the vasanas. I'll clarify a little bit more about this afterwards. Then in the next sentence, he said very much the same that he said in verse 12 of Upadēśa Undiyār, where he says that the mind and breath are two branches, their root is one. Here he says, manatikum prāṇanakum pirapidum andre. That means the birthplace for both for mind and for prana is one. What is the birthplace for mind and prana? It is Atma-vichara. That's our real nature, which is pure awareness. There he's talking about the root. Here he's talking about the birthplace. So obviously when the birthplace for a tree is the soil in which the seed is planted. The root of the tree is, in this case, ego. The two branches of the tree are mind and prāṇa. So the birthplace means our own real nature, which is pure awareness. It is from this that the mind and prāṇa rise. How they rise? First we rise as ego, and then branch out into these two branches of mind and prāṇa. Then he goes on to talk about the mind. In the next sentence he says, Nineve manatin sarupam. That means thought alone is the swarupa, the actual nature of the mind. And the mind is nothing but thoughts, as he says in a later verse, verse 18 of Upadēśa Undiyār. And then in the next sentence he says, Nānenam Nineve manatin mudul ninevu. The thought called I alone is the first thought of the mind. The mind, all thoughts collectively are mind, but of all those thoughts, the first one is this thought called I. Aduve ahankaram, that it alone is ego. So ego is the first thought, the thought called I. Why is it the first thought? Because ego is the subject, whereas all other thoughts are objects. Only when we rise as ego do we become the perceiver, the subject, and do we therefore know other thoughts which are objects. And then he says in the next sentence, Ahankaram engirandu uppatiyo angirandutan muchum kilambu kindredu. That is, from where ego rises, from there alone the breath also rises up. And then in the next sentence he says, Ahayal manamadangum podu prāṇanam, prāṇamadangu podu manamum adangam. That means when the mind ceases, subsides or disappears, the prāṇa also ceases. And when the prāṇa ceases, the mind also ceases. As I said earlier, if we curb the mind by turning our attention inwards, the breath will automatically calm down and eventually come to a standstill. If we are sufficiently keenly self-attentive, the breath will actually come to a standstill. If we notice it, then our attention has gone away from ourselves and it'll become active. But if we are focusing our attention only on ourselves, the breath will also stop. And likewise, when we restrain the breath, or when the breath ceases, the mind also ceases. Then there are three sentences which were later interpolated, which are a rather diluted explanation, which Bhagavan perhaps gave to someone who didn't, it wasn't part of the original questions and the answers that Bhagavan gave to Sri Prakasham Pillai. It was perhaps something that an answer that Bhagavan gave to someone who wasn't ready to accept his core teaching. But we can ignore those three sentences because they weren't part of the original essay as he wrote it. They were interpolated only in the mid-1930s sometime. So what in the original version, what he continued to say is, Prāṇam manatin stula rupam enapadam. The prāṇa is called, or is said to be, the gross form of the mind. Then in the next sentence he says, Marana kalam varayal manam prāṇane udlil veitu kondirundu udul marikum kalatil adane kavandu kondu pokiradu. That means, until the time of death, the mind keeps the prāṇa in the body. And at the moment the body dies, grasping it, that means grasping the prāṇa, the mind goes. That is, grasping the prāṇa, the mind departs. So the prāṇa is always accompanies mind. Whenever mind is active, prāṇa is also active. But I'll just briefly say what the other three sentences were. That is, someone had obviously asked Bhagavan, but the mind is not active in sleep. How is the breath continuing? So Bhagavan's, in answer to that, Bhagavan may have said, and this was explanation was then interpolated into Nāṉ Ār. Bhagavan said, however, in sleep, even though the mind has ceased, the prāṇa does not cease. This is not actually Bhagavan's teaching. According to Bhagavan, in sleep, there is no mind or body or world. So there's no question of there being any prāṇa in the absence of mind and body. But for those who are not ready to accept, but there is no body, world, or mind in sleep, this answer Bhagavan would have given. And then he goes on to explain, it is arranged thus by the ordinance of God for the purpose of protecting the body, and so that other people do not wonder whether the body has died. And then in the third of the three sentences, he says, when the mind ceases in waking and in samādhi, the prāṇa ceases. But this is, as I say, this is an explanation given to someone who wasn't ready to accept his core teaching, which is that there is no body or mind or prāṇa in sleep. So I'll come back to where I was about, as I said, he said, until the time of death, the mind keeps the prāṇa in the body, and at the moment the body dies, grasping it departs, the mind departs. Then the final sentence of this paragraph, he says, Ahayal prāṇāyāmam manate adaka sahayame andri manonasam sayadu. That means, therefore, prāṇāyāma is just an aid to restrain the mind or to make it temporarily cease, but it will not bring about manonasa. So now we can come back to this 13th verse of Upadēśa Undiyār, in which he talks about these two types of dissolution or of cessation of mind. One is laya and the other is nasa. Laya is temporary, so if the mind is in laya, it will rise again. The other is nasa, which is permanent, so if the mind dies in nasa, it will not rise again. How this is relevant here is because prāṇāyāma will not bring about destruction of the mind, by mere prāṇāyāma by itself is not sufficient. The question then arises, as I said, Bhagavan said, when the prāṇa becomes active, the mind again becomes active and wanders under the sway of its vasanas. The implication seems to be that but the vasanas are not weakened by restraining the breath. We can qualify this slightly. The vasanas are not destroyed, even to the slightest extent, in laya. When we fall asleep, when we wake up in the morning, we wake up with all the same vasanas. Whether we sleep for 2 hours or 6 hours or 8 hours, no vasanas are destroyed. To illustrate this, Bhagavan used to tell the story of a yogi on the banks of the Ganga. Whether this was some traditional story or it was just a story that Bhagavan made up to illustrate a point, doesn't really concern us. The story, as Bhagavan told it, is there was once a yogi who was doing tapas on the banks of the Ganga. He was practicing Raja-yōga. So by prāṇāyāma and other means, he was able to go into samādhi. And he was becoming more and more adept in his practice. And he had a disciple who was serving him. So he often, when he practiced his prāṇāyāma, he would go into samādhi for prolonged periods of time. And one day when he woke up from his samādhi, he was feeling thirsty. So he asked the disciple to go and fetch water from the Ganga for him to drink. The disciple went to fetch water, but by the time he come back, the yogi had again fallen back into nirvikalpa samadhi. And he remained in that state of nirvikalpa samadhi for 300 years. So in the meanwhile, the disciple had passed away, the Ganga had changed its course, the village that was there previously had moved to some other place. And eventually, after 300 years, when the yogi woke up, the first thing he did was to ask angrily, "Where's my water?" So Bhagavan said the last thought that was in his mind when he went into samadhi was the first thought that came after he awoke from samadhi. That shows that no vasanas are destroyed. However long you may remain in nirvikalpa samadhi, it doesn't destroy vasanas. So being in nirvikalpa samadhi is just a form of manōlaya and doesn't bring about spiritual practice, any spiritual progress. That is true of manōlaya. But what about the practice of prāṇāyāma and other yoga practices? Do they to any extent purify the mind? We could argue, yes, they do to a certain extent, because, for example, if you are so dedicated to pranayama but you're often curbing the mind, I'm not talking about going into laya, at least partially curbing the mind, you are thereby restraining the mind from following its vasanas. So possibly, to some extent, the practice of Raja-yoga may bring about some purification of mind, but it's not the most effective means. The most effective means, other than self-investigation, is practices of bhakti. The love is the key to purifying the mind. But even the practices of bhakti can purify the mind only to a certain extent. The only practice that can get rid of all vasanas is self-investigation, because by turning our attention to ourselves, we are directly we are refraining from being swayed by the Vishaya vasanas, that we're refraining from allowing our mind to be drawn outwards by our Vishaya vasanas. So as long as we cling to self-attentiveness without allowing our attention to go outwards, we are thereby weakening our Vishaya vasanas. And eventually, by self-investigation, we will root out the ego, which is the root of all vasanas. So self-investigation is by far and away the most effective means to purify the mind. As Bhagavan said in verse 8, it is anatinam uttamam, it is the best among all. It is also the only means by which we can we can bring about the complete purification of mind. Because, of course, the root of all impurities is our rising as ego. With all other impurities, the Vishaya vasanas, are Vishaya vasanas for whom? They're Vishaya vasanas only for us as ego. So as I said, the most effective means to purify the mind is self-investigation. Before we come to the path of self-investigation, the next most effective means is practices of bhakti. Well, more than the practices, it's the love with which those practices are done that purifies the mind. Because, for example, if we're meditating on God, we are not allowing our mind to go out to think about other problems we have, problems we may be facing in life, problems in the world, or anything like that. We are keeping our mind only dwelling on God. What keeps our mind dwelling on God is the love we have for God. So that will purify the mind to quite a considerable extent. Pranayama and other yoga practices may be slightly, because you're restraining the mind, you are slightly purifying the mind, but it's a very yoga practices are a very crude way of bringing about the of curbing the mind. And as Bhagavan says, it works so long as you're restraining the breath, but as soon as you let go of the breath, the mind also begins to wander under the sway of its vasanas. So even if there is some weakening of vasanas by the fact that in order to restrain we cannot restrain the breath without thereby restraining the mind. And by restraining the mind, we are thereby curbing the Vishaya vasanas to some extent. So to some extent, yoga practices may be bringing about the purification of mind, but it's only to a limited extent. And the danger with the yoga practices is that eventually, if we continue practicing yoga, pranayama and other yoga practices, it will eventually lead to manōlaya. And so long as we're in manōlaya, we're just in a dead end. We can't make any spiritual progress. Just like we don't make any spiritual progress in sleep, we can't make any spiritual progress in nirvikalpa samadhi or whatever. Nirvikalpa samadhi and sleep, they're just two different forms of manōlaya. Essentially, they are one and the same, because when the mind is absent, there are no differences. The difference between sleep and nirvikalpa samadhi is the means by which they're brought about. Sleep is brought about by tiredness. Nirvikalpa samadhi is brought about by yoga practices such as pranayama. That's the only difference between them. But in terms of spiritual efficacy, they have no spiritual efficacy. So how can we, if someone has been practicing yoga, how can they use that ability to curb the mind in order to bring about the permanent dissolution of mind? In other words, bring about manonasa. How is it possible? That is the answer given in verse 14, which is the key verse in this series of 5 verses. What Bhagavan says here is, Odaka valiye odungum ulate, vidukave ovari undipara, vium adam uru undipara. What that means is, Odaka valiye odungum ulate. That means odungum ulate vidukave ovari. That means when one sends the mind, the main part of this clause is ulate vidikave ovari. When one sends the mind on the one path, but he qualifies the mind here as oduka valiye odungum ulate. That is the mind which will become calm when one restrains the breath. So if we can, the mind will become calm if we restrain the breath. Before falling into manōlaya, we should then direct that mind on ovari, what he calls ovari. And when we do so, vium adon uru, that means its form will die, its form will perish. So the mind will be destroyed if we send it on the ovari. So what does he mean by ovari? Vari means path or means or way. Or we can interpret it in 2 ways here. Or can be a poetic abbreviation of aurum. Aurum means investigating or knowing. So ovari we can take as the investigating path, which implies the path of self-investigation, or can also be a form of oru, which means one. Technically speaking, but before a noun beginning with the consonant, such as vari, you should say oru vari. Or is like an in English, it's before a vowel, but or is used. As or is or and oru are like oru and or are like a and an in English. Or is before a vowel. But sometimes in poetry, they can ignore these rules, and you could use or to mean one before path. Whichever way we take it, whether we take it as the one path or the investigating path, it's one and the same thing, because there is only one path to bring about the destruction of the mind. As Bhagavan said in the first sentence of the 8th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, which I read earlier, manam adangu vatuku vicharane tavira vera tahantahu upayangalile. For the mind to cease, here he's implying permanent cessation, Except vicharana, there is no other adequate means. All other means will only bring about a temporary subsidence. Only vichara will bring about permanent subsidence. So what he refers to here as all worry is the path of self-investigation, which is, as I say, one of the two ways in which we can interpret or can be an abbreviation of aurum, which means investigating or knowing. So the path of knowing or the path of investigating, that is the path of self-investigation. So what Bhagavan implies here is that by restraining the breath, we can bring about a calmness of mind. We can partially restrain the mind. Before we restrain it fully and allow it to subside in laya, we need to then direct it inwards on this path of this investigating path. That's a path of self-investigation. That's turning our attention back towards ourselves. So if we curb the mind by pranayama, we shouldn't stop with just curbing the mind. We should, when the mind is sufficiently quietened down, we should use that quietened mind to focus, turn our attention back within to investigate ourselves. So pranayama can be an aid to self-investigation. It's not a necessary aid, because if we want to calm down the mind, what is the most effective means to do so? To turn the attention within. We don't, using pranayama as a means is a roundabout way. It may be suitable for some people, but it's not something that Bhagavan would ever recommend of his own accord. When people asked him about yoga, he would say yes. But as I said, he often said it's not even necessary to control the breath as in pranayama. Simply watching the breath will bring about a calmness of mind. And you should then use that calmness of mind to send the mind on the orvari, on the path of investigation. In other words, to direct the mind back within to know who am I. And that is, it's only then that the mind will perish. That he says that that is ullate orvari vidikave. Vidikave means only when one directs it on the path of knowing. Adun uru viyam. It's formed perish. So Bhagavan is very clearly emphasizing here that the mind will be destroyed only by turning it back within. In the Sanskrit version of this verse, Bhagavan didn't translate all very literally. He translated it, he adapted it or paraphrased it as ekachintana. Ekachintana means one thought or thought of one. Some people interpret this to mean, oh, Bhagavan said any one thought. So you can think of God, or you can think of a mantra or anything that will bring about destruction of mind. That's one way of interpreting it, but that's not in accordance with Bhagavan's teaching, because he emphasized so often that we cannot bring about destruction of mind by any means other than self-investigation. So when he talks, what does he mean when he talks about ekachintana in Sanskrit? Ekachintana isn't just for one thought, it is thought of the one. What is that one? That one is the one reality, that's ourself. So ekachintana is what he otherwise referred to as Atma-chintana. Atma-chintana is just another term for self-investigation. So he's implying the same thing in Sanskrit, but using a slightly different term. But in Tamil, this, as I say, this term not only means the one path, it also means the path of knowing or the path of investigation, which is the principal meaning in this context. So we shouldn't allow the mind to if we want to practice pranayama or to restrain the mind by restraining the breath, or even by watching the breath, we should go only to a certain extent in that direction. Then we have to change course. We have to use the mind that has been quietened by or partially restrained by pranayama to then direct it back within to know who am I. And then he concludes this this series of of verses with verse 15, in which he says, Manavuru maye mai mannam ma yogi, tanako seelile undipara, tanil sandanan undipara. What that means is, Manavuru maye mai mannam ma yogi. That means the great Tanaku is, it means for the great yogi who remains permanently. For the great Manavuru Maya means when the form of the mind is annihilated. Me mannam ma yogi Tanaku, for the great yogi who remains permanently as the reality, me means reality, or sail ile, there is not a single doing. Tan il sandanan, he has attained his nature. That means when the form of the mind is annihilated, for the great yogi who thereby remains permanently as a reality, there is not a single doing. There's no action or karma. Because isn't there, but it's implied, because he has attained his real nature. What is our real nature? Our real nature is just being, not doing. The significance of his saying here, but there's no action for this yogi. In yoga practices, are trying by pranayama and by various techniques of meditation, all of which are doings, it's trying to bring about a cessation of the mind, but only, as I say, it only can achieve a temporary cessation of mind. But once the mind is annihilated, there's nothing else that needs to be done. There's not a single action that needs to be done. This is, he says, likewise in Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, verse 31, he says, Tanne aritu erunda tanmayanandaku, enne uļḷadu ondrum eaku. That means, for those who are happiness composed of that, which arose destroying themselves, what one exists for doing. That is, that's referring to the jnani who is tanmayananda. That is, he is that happiness composed of tat. Tat means that, meaning brahman. So for the jnani who is established as brahmananda, as the supreme happiness of Brahman, which arises which arises destroying oneself. Destroying oneself here means ego. What exists for doing? That enne uļḷadu nāṛpadu, what one thing exists for doing. And then he says, Tanne aladu anyam ondru ariyā. They do not know anything other than themselves. Aba nilai me inadu endru enal evan. Who can conceive their state as like this? So we cannot conceive of their state, because their state is the state of just being as the supreme happiness that we always are. And because they're in a state of just being, there's nothing that needs to be done. You know, there's no action for them to do. Action is possible only when we rise as ego, and then there's body, mind, and speech, and through these body, mind, and speech we can act. But when we remain, if the mind is annihilated, then body and speech are annihilated with it. What remains is just pure tanmayananda. So for the great yogi who thus remains as the reality, there is nothing to be done. What is the reality? Just pure awareness, pure Satchidananda. Sat means what is, being. Chit is awareness, Ananda is happiness. So that is our real nature. And the great yogi, having annihilated the mind, he remains as that. How did he annihilate the mind? By sending it on the Orvari. But all vary is the path of self-investigation. So by investigating ourselves, the mind will die, and then there's no further action to be done. There's no need for any further pranayama or yoga exercises or anything. We just remain as we are. As Bhagavan said in verse 10, summarizing all these verses, verse 10 is, though it comes early on, it's a summary of the whole text. Udita idatil odungi irital. That means subsidingly being in the place from which we rose. So instead of rising as ego, if we subside back and remain just as we are, the place from which we rose, though we shouldn't take place here literally, place he's using here in the metaphorical sense, the source from which we rose, which is pure awareness. So being in that source, in that pure awareness from which we rose, subsiding and being in that pure, that is karma and bhakti, that is yoga and jnana. So everything comes to this state of just subsiding back into the place from which we arose. Once we subside back into that place from which we arose, there's no further action is necessary or possible, because there's no one left, there's no body, speech, or mind left to do any action. So I hope that that adequately covered those verses, but if you'd like to ask any more questions about them.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. We have a few questions. One of our fellow devotees, Venu, is asking, I'm confused as to how prana ceases in sleep. It is awareness via mind that ceases partially as it works inside on dreams, but the breath and prana are still alive.
Okay. Firstly, when Bhagavan talks about sleep, he's not talking about dream. There are three states. He distinguishes, well, there seem to be three states: waking, dream, and sleep. Actually, he says waking is just another dream. So actually, there are two states: there's dream and there's sleep. In dream, or including this present dream, which seems to be waking, we rise as ego. When we rise as ego, we project a body and world. We experience ourselves, well, we project a body, experience that body as I, and through the five senses of that body, we project a world. In dream, we experience a body and as ourself. When we wake up from a dream, from that dream to this dream, we don't suppose that the dream body in that dream existed independent of our perception of it. We know very well that while we're dreaming, the body that seems to be us and the world, they seem to exist independent of our perception of them. If we were having this discussion in a dream, you would say, oh, when I go to sleep, my body remains. Everyone else can see my body, but I'm asleep. In a dream, who is seeing your dream body? Only you are. All the others who you think are also seeing the dream body appear only in your view. The entire dream is a mental projection, the body and world, but seem to exist independent of our perception of them, or we assume they exist independent of our perception of them, so long as we are dreaming. As soon as we wake up, we recognize, oh, that was all just my own mental projection. That body and world didn't actually exist, except in my own mind. Likewise, Bhagavan says our present state is just a dream. So our present body and mind exist, our present body and world, this present body and world exist only in our mind. When we go to sleep, there is no mind, therefore there is no body and no world. And if there's no body and world, there's no prana. That is a teaching, but it's easy to understand, but it's difficult for most of us to accept. That is, we are so strongly attached to this, to our life in this world, but to accept that this all exists only in our own mind, but it's all just a dream. it is difficult for most of us to accept this. But to the extent that we're willing to accept this, we'll be willing to let go of it. And until we are willing to let go of it, we won't be able to know ourselves as we actually are. Because so long as we're clinging to the body and world, our attention is going outwards. We can't know ourselves as we actually are, because what we actually are is just pure awareness. And pure awareness, it means awareness that is aware of nothing other than itself. What is aware of body and world is only ego. Body and world are just appearances. They appear in whose view? In the view of ourself as ego. In sleep, we don't rise as ego, therefore then no body or world appears. Only in waking and dream do we rise as ego, and therefore a body and world seems to exist. Does that adequately answer your question?
Venu, does it answer your question, or do you have any follow-up questions? You can unmute yourself, please.
No, thank you. That really adequately answers my question. Thank you so much.
It may not be, as I say, it's easy to understand, but it's difficult for most of us to accept it.
Sure.
But being willing to accept is a very important step. Because ultimately, we've got to let go of everything. To know ourselves, we have to let go of everything else. So in order to be willing to let go of everything else, we need to be willing to accept what Bhagavan has taught us, but it's all just a mental projection.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you.
The next question is from Rabi. It says, according to Bhagavan, what is samadhi and what are the different types of samadhi? Because you did like I think you quoted nirvikalpa samadhi. So you could, this is probably a good time to just go over the different types of samadhi. And so
I don't think we have to go much into the subject of samadhi. Samadhi is, though the term samadhi is used in Advaita literature, and it's also used by Bhagavan, it is not a term that is native to Advaita philosophy. It is a term that originated from yoga philosophy. The term samadhi, it's been explained in various ways. One etymology, which is probably not the correct etymology, but it does convey the meaning very succinctly. Samadhi means samadhi. Di means mind. Sama means a state of equilibrium. So it's a state of equilibrium of mind. There are many states that to a greater extent could be considered as an equilibrium of mind. If while meditating you attain a certain degree of calmness, you could call that a type of samadhi. But you're still aware of things other than yourself. So that is a savikalpa samadhi. In nirvikalpa samadhi, there is no vikalpas, no differences, no changes. So a nirvikalpa state is a state like sleep, a state of manōlaya. Well, a state of manonasa is also a nirvikalpa state, but generally when yogis talk about nirvikalpa samadhi, they're talking about a type of laya. As I said, there is the only difference between sleep and any other state of manōlaya is not a difference in the state itself, because all differences exist only in the mind. So in sleep, there's no mind, and therefore there are no differences. That's why it's called nirvikalpa. Nirvikalpa means without vikalpa. Vikalpa means change or difference. So there can be no difference between one nirvikalpa state and another nirvikalpa state. The only difference between sleep and other states of laya is how it is brought about. When we fall asleep, it's because of tiredness. Our mind has been active throughout the day, projecting all this dream, and we can only carry on for a certain length of time before we become too tired to continue. Then we subside back into sleep. In sleep, we remain as we actually are, and thereby metaphorically speaking, the batteries of the mind are recharged. And so when we've got recharged, we again jump up as ego and carry on with another dream or so-called waking state. So the cause of sleep is tiredness. There are other states of manōlaya. If you're given general anesthesia, that will bring about a state of manōlaya. If you go for a major surgery, they give you general anesthesia, and that will put you in a sleep-like state. In fact, even whereas in sleep, if someone were to cut you, you'll wake up. In anesthesia, you're so deeply absorbed in manōlaya that you are not disturbed even by the cutting and whatever else they may be doing. If you have a major car accident and have head injuries, you may end up in a coma for some days or weeks or months or even years. That is also a type of manōlaya. You can also bring about manōlaya by certain recreational drugs. There's so many ways you can bring about manōlaya. Among the ways to bring about manōlaya are yoga practices. By prāṇāyāma and by other yoga practices, you can bring about a sleep-like state, which is called nirvikalpa samadhi. But Bhagavan often used to refer to it as kashta nirvikalpa samadhi. Kashta means like a log of wood. You remain like a log of wood. It's Bhagavan always emphasized, as I told you in that story of that yogi on the banks of Ganga, though he remained 300 years in that state of samadhi, he woke up with the same thought that he had gone into that state. So none of his vasanas were destroyed. So being in that state for so long, it's just you're not making any progress on your journey. It's just like if you're traveling on a train from Houston to New York. If your carriage happens to be parked in a station on the way and left on a sideline, and everyone forgets about it, you don't get any closer to New York. Only when another train comes and you connect onto the other train can you proceed on your journey. So being in laya is just like that. It's just like a temporary stop on the journey. So there's no benefit in achieving this sort of samadhi. The only sort of samadhi that Bhagavan said we should seek to achieve is what he calls sahaja samadhi. Sahaja samadhi is nothing but our own natural state of just being as we actually are. Generally, when Bhagavan talked about, Bhagavan used the term nirvikalpa samadhi as a synonym for the state of Atma-vichara, the state of annihilation of ego. But he also sometimes talked about it as a practice. In his introduction to his Tamil translation of Drisya Viveka, he talks about Tanaye Bahyanta Drishti Bedam Indri Epodum Nadam Sahaja Samadhi Parakatal. That means by the practice of Sahaja Samadhi, which is investigating oneself, which is always investigating oneself without the Drishti Veda of within and without. That is being so keenly attentive, but we're not even aware of the distinction between this and in and out. That is the practice of what he calls as Sahaja Samadhi Parakata, the practice of Sahaja Samadhi. So that is the only samadhi Bhagavan recommends we should aim for or we should practice. And that is nothing but being self-attentive. So because the terms, when people hear the term samadhi and they hear that it's the goal of yoga, that is to achieve states of samadhi, people think it's some very great achievement. Bhagavan says no samadhi is the only samadhi that is worth seeking is sahaja samadhi, which is our own natural state. We are always actually in the state of sahaja samadhi, but so long as we rise as ego, we seem not to be in that state. So we need to turn our attention within to investigate ourselves, and then we will see that we have always been in sahaja samadhi. Does that adequately answer your question, Ravi?
Thank you, Michael. It was very good. It was very helpful.
Right.
Next question I have is, I think it's going back to a bit of to the core. Why is a calm mind needed to know ourselves as we are?
Ah. What is it? All mental activity is directed away from ourselves. That is, when our attention is directed towards anything other than ourselves, our mind is active. So to the extent that the mind is active, we are facing away from ourselves. But we don't need to artificially bring about a calmness of mind by pranayama in order to attend to ourselves. Because as soon as we turn our attention back towards ourselves, our mind is thereby calmed down, because we're ceasing to attend to other things.
Right, so it's better to start with self-enquiry itself.
If we
Could I ask a further question?
Can I just say one thing? If we understand Bhagavan's teachings, if we're ready to accept Bhagavan's teachings, but this is ultimately the only way, no other practices are necessary. All we need to do is to try to turn our attention back to ourselves. We may not succeed very well. We may often be stumbling and failing in our attempts, but so long as we're trying, that's all that matters, and that's all we need to do. As Bhagavan says in Nāṇ Ār, in the 11th paragraph, Oruvan tan surupate adeyam varayal nirantar surupa smaranaye kai patruvanayen adu andre podom. That is, if one clings, if one holds firmly onto swarupa smarana, that literally means self-remembrance, or implies self-attentiveness, nirantara, uninterrupted self-remembrance, until one attains oneself, one's own real nature, that alone is sufficient. So this is all we need to do. Nothing else is necessary. Even if we're not able to hold on to it uninterruptedly, the more we try to hold on to it, the more we will come closer to that state where we're holding on to it uninterruptedly. Just all we need to do is to go, keep on trying to attend to ourselves. No other practice is necessary. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you, Dee.
No, Deepti, go ahead. You had a follow-up question?
If you permit me, yes, please.
Yeah, certainly.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Yes, Michael. So this I understand a calm mind it can be achieved directly by self-inquiry. That it's not you don't need prāṇāyāma or yoga. That's very clear. But what I'm confused about is the way to ourself through the mind. I mean, do we need a calm, peaceful state of mind to know ourselves? Is that the path?
What is mind? Mind, as Bhagavan said, the Nineve Manatin Sarupam. Thought alone is the nature of the mind. So mind is nothing but thoughts. But of all the thoughts that rise in the mind, the first thought and the root of all other thoughts is the thought called I. That is ego. So long as we are aware of anything other than ourselves, we are aware of ourselves as ego. That is, we are never aware of anything other than ourselves, except in the state where we have risen as ego and thereby identify a body and mind as ourselves. Since we now experience ourselves as ego, we need to, we can't but go through ego, so to speak. But we rise. How do we rise as ego? As Bhagavan says, Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, grasping form it rises. Urupatri Nikam, grasping form it stand. Urupatri Undu Mika Ongam, grasping and feeding on form it flourishes. It here means ego, which he describes as a formless phantom. So we rise as ego only by grasping forms. We stand as ego by grasping forms, and we feed and feed ourselves and flourish as ego by grasping forms. So, so long as we are grasping form, we cannot know ourselves as we actually are. In order to know ourselves as we actually are, we, this form grasping ego, need to cease grasping form and try to grasp ourselves. Know what we actually are. When we try and grasp ourselves, because what are we? Bhagavan describes Uruvatrapeya Hande, formless phantom ego. So when we try and grasp this formless phantom, because so long as it's grasping other forms, it seems to exist. When it tries to grasp itself, it dissolves and disappears. That's why he says in that same verse, verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Tedinal otum pidicum. With thought, it takes flight. So we as ego need to investigate ourselves, this ego. When we investigate this ego, as he says in the next verse, verse 26 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Adalal Yadu Idu, wait a second, concludes in verse 26, he says, if Ahande Undying and Atum. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande Indrel, Indru and Atum. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Ahande Yabamam. Ego itself is everything. Adalal Yadu Idu Indru Nagale, Ovadal Yabam and Or. Therefore, know that investigating what this ego is alone is giving up everything. He doesn't say this ego, he says investigating what this is alone is giving up everything. This, or idu, refers to ego. So what is, it's only by investigating, how can we see what the snake actually is, except by looking at it very carefully? So you could say metaphorically, we have to go through the snake to see the rope. It's only by looking very carefully at the snake, but we can see that it's actually a rope. It's only by investigating ego, by looking at it very carefully, but we can see that there's no snake, there's no ego at all, there is only pure awareness. Just like if we look at the snake very carefully, we'll see that there is no snake, there's only a rope.
So you're saying
the snake is never anything other than a rope. Likewise, ego is never anything other than pure awareness. The difference between pure awareness and ego is not a difference in substance, it's a difference in appearance. Just like the difference between the rope and the snake is not a difference in substance. They're both the same thing. Just a difference in appearance.
So we need a relatively stable and a healthy ego. I mean, if an agitated or a depressed ego is not a conducive means for self-inquiry.
Agitation and depression are both thoughts or collections of thoughts. We are depressed only. If the mind wasn't facing outward, it would be neither agitated nor depressed. Depression, when we face outwards, God, this world is a bit depressing place. When we see what's going on now, we've got plenty of reason to be depressed. And we all know, what is this bodily life? We're here for a few years.
Yep.
We had the pain of being born and then going through childhood and maybe being bullied in school and stress of passing exams and then going to university and passing more exams and then getting married and all the stress of marriage and having children and paying a mortgage or whatever. And we grow old.
I know this too well.
And one day we're all going to die.
Yes.
So what sort of life is this? If we think about it, we've got plenty to be depressed about. But why to be depressed by looking outwards? Why not look inwards and be happy? Because Bhagavan says our real nature is happiness. So those people who are depressed are those who are allowing themselves to be swayed by, to be dragged hither and thither by their vasanas. Whether we are said to be mentally healthy or mentally sick, we're all under. I mean, what mental sickness, mental ill health, is nothing but an extreme form of the problem we all face, which is allowing ourselves to be dragged hither and thither by our vasanas.
Okay. So we don't necessarily need a stable or a like unperturbed ego to inquire into ourselves.
The very nature of ego is to be perturbed. As ego, we are never at peace. Even though we may enjoy fleeting pleasures here and there in life, we are never really at peace. There's always an underlying dissatisfaction, discontent. Why is that? Because our real nature is infinite satisfaction, infinite happiness. So we cannot be satisfied with anything less than infinite satisfaction. So we have a desire for something, we achieve that thing, we're temporarily satisfied, we enjoy a little pleasure from that thing, and then again we're dissatisfied. We want something more, we want something else. So dissatisfaction is the very nature of ego. But we should use that dissatisfaction to our advantage. We should think about it. Why am I dissatisfied? Because there's nothing in this world. Dissatisfaction is inevitable. Whatever we achieve cannot satisfy us. We need to think deeply about it. Why are we never satisfied? Because nothing in this world can satisfy us for long. They seem to temporarily satisfy us, or at least partially satisfy us for a short time, but we're never fully satisfied and we're never permanently satisfied. So if we think deeply about this, we should use this dissatisfaction to our advantage. We should understand that there's no lasting happiness can be attained from anything outside. In fact, according to Bhagavan, no happiness is ever attained from anything outside. The happiness we seem to achieve from things outside, that happiness isn't coming from outside, it's coming from within. Because our mind, which is agitated by desire, or fear or whatever, when the object of our fear or the object is removed or the object of our desire is achieved, we temporarily, the mind is calmed down a little and we experience a little bit of pleasure until we again become agitated by something else. So there's no happiness to be obtained from anything outside. We need to think carefully about this and understand the reason for this. And only when we understand this will we be willing to begin to try to turn our attention within.
Yes, great. Yes, thank you very much for your time.
Right.
Thank you, Michael. The next question pertains to the verse 15 of Upadēśa Undiyār. Assuming, the question goes like this: assuming Sri Sadhu Om was able to be in the state of his real self, how did this state manifest or appear in the eyes of his friends and devotees, for example, like you?
Let's leave Sadhu Om aside. Let's talk about Bhagavan. Bhagavan is in that state. Nobody has any doubt about that. But in our view, Bhagavan seems to be active. Bhagavan seems to have written Upadēśa Undiyār, Nāṇ Ār, Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Arunachal Stuti Panchakam. He answered so many questions. He cut vegetables in the dining hall. He wandered on the hill. He walked around the hill. There's so many activities he seems to have done. But Bhagavan says he's never done anything. How do we reconcile that? Why Bhagavan seems to us to be active? Not only Bhagavan seems to be active, Bhagavan is in the egoless state, mindless state. He has no mind. But how then can he answer questions and write poems and things, we think? Because Bhagavan not only has no mind, he has no body either. It's only in our view that because we mistake ourselves to be a body and mind, we mistake him to be a body and mind. We mistake ourselves to be a person, we mistake him to be a person. But actually, he is not the person he seems to be. He's not the body he seems to be. So Bhagavan, when that ego that was aware of itself as I am Venkataraman died on that day in Madurai, after that intense fear of death came, that was the end of the story. there was no more action. Bhagavan was that Manavuru Maye Mai Manama Yogi. That's perfect description of Bhagavan. By turning his attention within, he'll become that. His mind had died, and thereby he was established as the reality. For the reality, but reality means pure awareness. There's no action to do. So Bhagavan is just that pure awareness. Bhagavan is Satchidananda. Is Satchidananda doing anything? No, it's perfectly content as it is, just being. Sat means just being. Chit means just being aware, not being aware of anything, but just being aware. And Ananda doesn't mean being happy because of anything, but just being happy, because happiness is its nature. So Bhagavan is nothing but Satchidananda. So for him, there was never anything to do. In our view, Bhagavan seemed to be active. Bhagavan even sometimes used to seem to get angry when people behaved in an inappropriate way, particularly if they were, if Bhagavan saw anyone being cruel to animals or even beating a mango tree to knock down the mangoes. He would sometimes seemingly get angry. Whatever anger was there was appropriate to the circumstances. But Bhagavan himself was never angry. So as he says in that verse 31, which I read earlier, verse 31 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, he says, Uļḷadu Nāṛpadu. He does not know anything other than himself. Aber nileme inadu endru unul evan. Who can understand his state as it is like this? We cannot conceive of what Bhagavan's state is, because though in our view he seems to be a person, and he seems to be interacting with the world just as we are, in his view, he doesn't know anything other than himself. He's not aware of anything other than himself, which is just pure awareness. Does that adequately answer your question?
I think so. And then the phrase in the Malayalam words also comes to my mind related to that. Vesatale manishanai tonum.
Oh yes, I forgot about the Malayalam version. Yes, yeah.
I'm sorry, Vesatale manishanai kanum.
Yes, can you translate that for us?
Who is seen as a man or human being by outward appearance.
Vesha means by costume, by disguise.
Yeah. So so even he self-realized, they look like a regular human being to us, but they're not.
They're not, yes.
I think, there is a couple more questions. Anil asks, can we say that our waking state is the dream state of Brahman?
Brahman never dreams. Brahman is just pure awareness. Who is the dreamer? The dreamer is ego. So whether you're waking state or dream state, it's all dreams of the one ego.
Right.
There may be some Upanishads or some Advaitic text that allegorically say that this is a dream of Brahman or whatever. There are many, because there are many different levels of explanation within Advaita. If you ask many scholars of Advaita, they will tell you that a waking state isn't a dream. Waking state is like a dream. Dream is an analogy that is used to explain the waking state. The waking state is different from dream. In waking state, you identify with the Sthula Sarira. In dream, you identify with the Sukshma Sarira. They believe in these differences, but according to Bhagavan, there is no difference between waking and sleep and dream. What we call waking is just another dream. And even when we're dreaming, it seems to us that we're awake. So what evidence do we have that our present state is anything other than a dream? There's nothing that we experience in our present state, but we couldn't equally well experience in a dream. So there's absolutely no evidence that waking is anything other than a dream. So why should we believe something? We all assume waking is different to dream, but when we're dreaming, we make the same assumption, thinking we are then awake. So why should we make these assumptions? And that's what Bhagavan said, don't believe what you don't know. We don't know that our present state is not a dream, so we shouldn't believe it. Bhagavan asks us to question all our beliefs, all our assumptions, including the most fundamental assumption, I am this person, I am this body. Even that is not true according to Bhagavan. It's because why this present state seems to be waking and the world we experience now seems to be external to ourselves, because we are aware of ourselves as I am this body. What is this body? It's something that appeared in this world some 60 or 70 years before and is going to pass on after a few more years. It's the world existed before this body and the world will exist after that body. So it seems to us, so long as we are identified with that body. When we are dreaming, the dream world seems to exist external to ourselves and therefore independent of ourselves. If someone asks, did this world exist before you were born? We say, yes, of course it existed before I was born. In your dream, that is. So we assume that world we are experiencing there existed before we were born and will exist after we die. And whether we see it or not, it's still there. But as soon as we wake up, we recognize, oh, that world I saw then and that body which I mistook to be I, they were all my own mental creation. How is that change brought about? Why were we not able to recognize that while we were dreaming, but we are able to recognize it as soon as we wake up? Because while dreaming, we experience that dream body as I. So long as we experience the dream body as I, because I am real, the dream body seems to be real. And because the dream body is a part of the dream world seems to be real. But as soon as we wake up, that's as soon as we leave one dream and come to another dream, the previous dream, we are no longer, our identification with the body of the previous dream is severed. We no longer experience that dream body as I. As soon as we cease to experience that dream body as I, we then recognize, oh, it was just a mental projection. It wasn't real. And likewise, the world we saw then wasn't real. And all the people in that world we saw, with whom we were having conversations and doing this and that, none of them were real. They were all our own mental creation. But so long as we were identified with that dream body, it all seemed to be real. Likewise, because we are now identified with this dream body, this present dream world seems to be real.
As the waker becomes a dreamer, and the dreamer has all these people and all the samsara created in his dream by the mind of the waker who has slept. If we take a step back and we say we are Brahman, all of us are one part of one Brahman. So isn't it this creates an atmosphere where everybody we see in the waking state, per se, that we call waking state, which is in a way is dream state, but the one that exists is a Brahman itself. So everybody, all of us on this chat group right now are also Brahman. Are they different shapes and forms of same Brahman? So that's what my analogy was, that this Brahman is existing as this multiple people and everything, but it is really if there is a Brahman sleeps, then this is who we are.
Well, first, we need to distinguish between Brahman as it is and Brahman as it seems to be. Ego is Brahman. Ego is nothing but Brahman. But Brahman is not ego. That is, Brahman is what appears as ego, but Brahman is not ego.
Right.
So it is only as ego that we can say Brahman is dreaming. But Brahman as Brahman is never dreaming. Brahman as Brahman always remains as it is. So all this it's all only in the view of ourself as ego. It's only when we rise as ego that all this seems to exist. Yes, as Bhagavan says, Handeya Yavamam, ego itself is everything. So all that we see now is nothing but an expansion of ego. And if we investigate ego, we find it's nothing but Brahman, pure awareness, prajnanam. But so long as we are seeing things other than ourselves, we are not experiencing ourselves as pure awareness. We're not experiencing ourselves as Brahman. We're experiencing ourselves as ego. So the dreamer, both of this present state that we call waking, and of all other dreams, only ourself as ego. As Brahman, we never dream anything. So we are Brahman, as you say, but we are not experiencing ourselves now as Brahman. So how to experience ourselves as Brahman, Bhagavan has explained very beautifully in verse 27 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. It's a very, very important verse. Nāṇ Ār uļḷadu Nāṛpadu. That is, the state in which one exists without I rising, or without rising as I, is the state in which we exist as that. That means Brahman. Adu means Brahman in this context. So in order to experience ourselves as Brahman, we had to be in the state in which we don't rise as ego. So how to be in that state in which we don't rise as ego? He answers it with using a rhetorical question in the next sentence. Nān udikum tanum ade nādāmal, nān Ār tan iripe savadu eban. That means without investigating the place from which we rise as I, how to attain the destruction of oneself in which I does not rise. That is how, in order I will not rise only when it is destroyed. And in order to attain that state in which it is destroyed, we need to investigate the source from which we've risen. What is the source from which we've risen? It's not anything other than ourselves. We've risen only from ourselves. We've risen as ego from ourselves. So we need to investigate ourselves. And then he says in the final sentence, Saramal tan aduam tan nilayil nipadu eban satru. That means without reaching that state of our own annihilation, say how to stand in the state of oneself in which oneself is that. So if we want to experience ourselves as Brahman, we need to cease rising as ego. And in order to cease rising as ego, we need to investigate ourselves to see what we actually are.
So how does two people who have reached the state of Brahman see each other?
No person can ever reach the state of Brahman. Only Brahman can know Brahman. To tell you the truth, no person ever knows anything. We now think, I am a person, I am Michael, or I am Anil. We are identifying ourselves as a person, and therefore we think Michael is aware and knowing things, Anil is aware and knowing things. What is aware and knowing things is only the ego who is aware of itself as I am Anil, not Anil. Anil is just Jada. What is Anil? Anil consists of 5 sheaths: body, prāṇa, mind, intellect, and will. These 5 make up the person called Anil. But all these 5 sheaths are Jada, as Bhagavan says in verse 22 of Upadēśa Undiyār. Jada and Asat. So they're not I. So ego is not the person that it seems to be. So the person cannot know Brahman. Even ego cannot know Brahman, because when ego knows Brahman, it ceases to be ego and it remains as Brahman. So what realizes Brahman is only Brahman. Brahman cannot be known by anyone other than Brahman.
Yes.
So what is called Brahmanyana is nothing but the manonasa, the annihilation of mind, the dissolution of ego. That is the state that is called Brahmanyana. What remains in that state is only Brahman. So only Brahman knows Brahman. And then, since there are no two Brahmans, there's no question of one Brahmanyani seeing another Brahmanyani. According to Bhagavan, Bhagavan often used to say, Jnana me Jnani. That means Jnana alone is the Jnani. Jnana means pure awareness. So what can know pure awareness other than pure awareness? So only pure awareness is the Jnani. So the Jnani is not a person, not a human form. Because Bhagavan is a Jnani, but though he's a Jnani, we see him as a person and we say he's a self-realized person. But that shows our ignorance, because no person is self-realized. Because there's no ego in that person, that Brahman was shining through him. Shining through his eyes, shining through his words, shining through every loving gesture of his.
Understand.
But that person, so we, from our point of view, we can say Bhagavan is Brahman. We can worship him as Brahman, but we are not seeing him as Brahman. If we want to see him as Brahman, we need to see ourselves as Brahman. Only when we see ourselves as Brahman will we be able to see him as Brahman. So long as we continue in our state of ignorance, we are guilty of the crime of Brahmahati. We are killing Brahman. We are seeing even Bhagavan as an Ajnani, because we see Bhagavan as a person. If we see Bhagavan as a person, that means we take him to be an Ajnani, because a person cannot know Brahman. So the only way the only prayaschitta for this heinous sin of Brahmahati is death sentence, death penalty for the ego. And how to kill ego? Know that you are Brahman, and thereby ego is annihilated.
Yes, I understand. So, no, I think Bhagavan was a Brahman, and you are a Brahman. So,
Tatvamasi.
Yeah, that's it.
You are that. You are that.
Yes.
You don't have to look for Brahman outside. You cannot find Brahman outside, because so long as you're looking outside, it's only what looks outside is ego. If you want to see yourself as Brahman, look within.
True. Yes.
Everything is Brahman.
Yes.
Everything is Brahman. But so long as you're seeing Brahman as everything, you're not seeing Brahman as Brahman. Because Brahman is not everything. Brahman is one thing. That everything is, Brahman is what appears as everything, but what Brahman actually is only one.
One. Yes.
Ekam advaitiyam. So long as we see otherness, we are not seeing Brahman. Only when we see oneness, without any second, ekam eva advaitiyam, that is Brahman.
Yes, understand.
So there is, thank you, Michael. There's another question here. When we going to sleep, are we unknowingly going into manōlaya?
Yes.
Or I'm unknowingly practicing prāṇāyāma or rāja-yōga.
We are not unknowingly going. We know very well when we are in sleep, we're in manōlaya. We all know there's no mind in sleep. So when we're asleep, we don't say I'm in manōlaya. But when we're in waking state, we know mind was absent then.
Right. So when we wake up, we know. So there's
manōlaya exists only from the perspective of the mind.
Right.
But the truth is, there is no mind, and therefore there's no manōlaya. There's no mind even to be destroyed. How to destroy the mind? By seeing that there never was any mind to be destroyed. Manatin uruve maravadu chava manamenam ondrile undipala. He says in verse 17, which we'll be talking about next time.
Right.
Or
So,
maybe from here on we can go one verse at a time. I don't know.
Yeah, let's do that. So as a quick recap, but it is better to practice self-inquiry itself as a calming technique or as a purifying technique. So that way it's a lot easier when you proceed to the one technique that you really need to be self-realized,
Yes.
self-enquiry. So start from there, and so you can go through that. It's the process is, you know, is continuous.
Yes, that's true. But I think even to think of it as a technique is a little bit misleading. A technique means something that is, if you've got something difficult to do, you need a technique to do it. If you've got a big boulder you need to move, you've got to find some technique. You can't lift the boulder. So you need to put a log of wood there and have a strong steel bar, and then you can use it as a lever and you can move that boulder. That's a technique. But what is the technique for seeing something? You only, if you want to see something, you look at it. Would you put looking a technique for seeing? It's too much of a loaded word. If you want to see something, look at it. If you want to see yourself, look at yourself.
So, but for some who really need some calming methods, as you mentioned, the bhakti processes are much better to follow, right? And so the first choice would be self-enquiry itself. If not, so just, you know, pick a bhakti method of your choice. And if that also is not possible, then it appears Bhagavan is saying, yes, you can do pranayama, provided you use the calmness that comes with pranayama immediately to focus on your awareness.
I think yoga practices, they're suitable for people who have a very strong sense of doership, who, what can I do to get this? I want to do something. And those who aren't, and if they've got a strong sense of doership, and if they're not attracted to bhakti, then yes, then okay, start off with pranayama, try and control your mind, see the difficulty of controlling your mind, experience that however many times you control your mind by yoga techniques, as soon as you stop your pranayama or meditation or whatever, again the mind jumps out and again wanders under the sway of its vasanas. When you've tried this and found it's of no use, then you will begin to become more submissive and think, okay, even in Yoga Sutras, there's the yoga philosophy is based largely on Sankhya, which is not a theistic philosophy. In Sankhya, there's no place for God. In yoga, they make a little bit of place for God. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, I think in one of the sutras, he mentions surrender to God as one option. But other than that, there's no mention of God at all in yoga or in Sankhya. So long as we think I can do, I must do, then yoga is suitable. When we try our best at yoga and find we're not able to do anything, then we hold up our hands and say, God, you saved me. I can't do anything. I surrender to you. That is the beginning of path of bhakti.
Another point I noticed.
Even to surrender to God, we think we surrender to God, but again our mind jumps up and we complain, oh, why this happened, why that happened. Then we understand, oh, we're not surrendered as we would like to think we are. So how to surrender myself more? Then we progress along the path of bhakti, and eventually we come to understand we can surrender everything else. We can try and surrender our will, our likes, our dislikes, our desires, our attachments. We can try and surrender all these things. We cannot surrender mind completely so long as I remain. So long as there's an I, there will also be likes, dislikes, attachments, and so on. So for surrender to be complete, it needs to be self-surrender. We need to surrender ourselves. But how can we surrender ourselves? We can give up everything. Even if we could give up everything else, how can we give up ourselves? We cannot give up what we actually are. We can give up what we are not. So since what we now take to be ourselves is ego, this ego is what needs to be surrendered to God. And how do we surrender ego to God? Bhagavan is explained. Anma chintane tavera, vera chintane kalambavataku satram idam kodamo, Atmanishta paranai irpade, tane isanaku alipadam. That is, without giving the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than Atma-chintana, that's self-attentiveness, being as Atmanishta Param, one who's firmly established as oneself, is giving oneself to God. So in order to give ourselves to God, we need to investigate ourselves. When we know what we actually are, that itself is giving ourselves to God. Because when we know what we actually are, we will find there is no separate I, there is only God. So we have lost ourselves in God, we've dissolved in God.
Another tip that I noticed that you mentioned, during the discussion of these verses, is for someone who practices pranayama and sort of calms his mind. There's you made a beautiful point. He needs to immediately get into that orvali before he gets into manōlaya. So
Yeah.
he has only that small window there. Because he gets into manōlaya, it may be a waste, right?
Yeah.
So he has to get into that orvali, that meaning that one path of looking at his own awareness before he gets into manōlaya. Because once he gets there, then the process becomes a waste. So he has to make use of that calmness that he just derived from the pranayama. Is that right?
Yes, but in order to achieve manōlaya, or nirvikalpa samadhi as it's called, as a result of pranayama, you have to be quite adept in pranayama. It may take many years of practice before you get, unless it's a resumption of what you've been doing in previous lives, it's not easy to get into manōlaya. So most people, if they start off practicing pranayama, long before they reach the stage where they keep on sinking into nirvikalpa samadhi, like that yogi on the banks of the Ganga that Bhagavan, in the story Bhagavan talked about, long before you reach that stage, if you're wise, you turn your mind, you just need a little bit of calmness of mind, and then take a bunch of that by turning the attention back within.
So yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are always going to be a lot of people who use some form of pranayama or its variants to calm their mind, but they just have to use it immediately to turn within,
Yes.
to focus on the Atman.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's only a temporary benefit.
Yeah. So that's a really good tip for those who practice, pranayama.
But it's a good tip for them only if they're attracted to this path. Most people who are attracted to the path of yoga will not be particularly attracted to this path. Or maybe after they've been practicing yoga for a long time and are frustrated by the temporary benefits of it, then they may be willing to turn to this path. But for the majority of people who are attracted to the path of yoga, they will not find this path particularly attractive. Generally, those who have you can go straight from yoga to the path of jnana, but for many yogis, they're more likely to go from yoga to the next step, which is bhakti, then on to jnana. But Bhagavan gives a clue. If they take this all very straight away from their pranayama, they can thereby bring about the annihilation of the mind.
Yeah, that's
But some bhakti is presumed there, because in order to annihilate the mind, we need to be willing to let go of everything else. Why would we let go of everything else without love? So the bhakti is implied there.